Imagine returning to your family's ancestral ranch after years away, only to be ambushed by a power-hungry neighbor who turns your homecoming into an all-out war. Welcome to the showdown that proves some battles are won with grit, not just guns. It all started the very second my truck's tires touched the gravel of my own driveway. The air still filled with dust and my heart beating with that bittersweet rhythm of coming home after years of staying away. Yet before I could even breathe in the smell of sagebrush and dry summer wind, a shrill voice shattered the moment like glass, screaming, "You can't park there. This is HOA property." And before I could even blink, a phone was already at her ear, her arm flapping like a broken windmill. As she yelled for the police to come and arrest me on my own ranch, a sight so absurd it froze me between laughter and disbelief. Like walking into a comedy show I hadn't bought a ticket for. And that was the exact moment I knew my peaceful return had just turned into a full-blown war zone where logic would have no home and drama would rule every breath. I stepped out of the truck slowly, boots crunching the dry earth, my dog leaping out happily beside me, while Karen, that neighbor I had only heard horror stories about, was pacing in front of my gate like a sheriff from a cheap Western movie who had lost her badge, jabbing her finger toward my land and barking orders at no one but herself, while the operator on the phone was clearly asking for details she couldn't give. The sun was dropping low, painting the sky orange, and all I wanted was to walk into the house my grandfather built. But the way she glared at me, you would have thought I was an outlaw trying to rob her precious kingdom. My hands were still on my truck door when the first patrol car arrived, sirens off, but lights flickering, and the cop stepped out with that tired look of a man who knew before he even got there that this was going to be a waste of his time. Karen ran to him, shrieking that a strange man had invaded HOA territory, screaming about bylaws and code violations, while I just stood there holding my deed in one hand and my patience by a thread. The cop glanced at me, at my truck, still half loaded with my belongings, then at Karen, who was near tears, claiming I was squatting on stolen land, and in that moment, the sheer ridiculousness of it all hung in the air thick enough to choke on. I handed over my paperwork, explaining calmly, this was my ranch, my name on the title, my grandfather's name before mine, this gate, and every inch of barbed wire belonging to us long before any HOA was ever dreamed up, and the cop's eyebrows lifted like he'd just solved the easiest case of his career. Karen's face twisted as he told her there was no crime here, no trespassing, nothing at all, but a man going home. She sputtered about HOA rules applying to everyone, pointing wildly at her clipboard of fake citations until the cop finally told her she had no authority past the edge of the subdivision. She stood there red-faced, clutching her papers like a lifeline, muttering promises of legal action, as if the words themselves could change the truth carved into the land beneath our feet. I thought that would be the end of it, a stupid misunderstanding left behind with the sunset. But as the patrol car rolled away and the crickets began their nightly chorus, I felt Karen's stare burn holes through my back, and I knew this was only round one of a fight I hadn't asked for, but wasn't about to lose. Inside the house, the memories were everywhere. My grandfather's old rocking chair on the porch, the smell of pine from the beams he carved by hand. And for a moment, I felt grounded, like this land still remembered me, even if the new neighbors didn't want me here. But peace was already a stranger on my return because Karen's voice carried over the fence in the dark, barking into her phone about emergency HOA meetings, new bylaws to draft, plans to handle the problem next door. I sat on the porch with my boots up, my dog curled at my feet, sipping from a bottle I had left in the kitchen years ago, and wondering how someone could hate another person just for coming home. Yet the more I listened, the more a slow grin spread across my face. Because if Karen thought she was going to bully me off the land my bloodline built, she had no idea who she was messing with. This wasn't just a return. This was the start of something bigger. A storm about to roll in. And while she thought she held power behind her HOA rules and threats of police calls, the truth was this ranch and I had a backbone tougher than any committee could imagine. I stood up that night under the stars, walked the fence line with my flashlight, and every step reminded me that no HOA paper pusher was going to write me out of my own history. Karen had fired the first shot with her phone call and her lies, but she had just handed me every reason to fight back. And tomorrow, when she tried again, she was going to find out this ranch wasn't a place you could push someone around without consequences. Little did she know the first locked gate was coming, and after that a trap for her car that would make her scream louder than she did today. She had turned my homecoming into a battlefield, and I was already sharpening my sense of humor and my revenge for every round we had ahead. The morning after my dramatic return to the ranch started with the kind of calm that always feels suspicious. The kind where the sun rises a little too quietly and you know deep down the storm hasn't passed. It's just circling back for another round. I walked out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee. The smell of dust and sage hanging in the air. And there she was again, Karen, standing near the property line like a hawk waiting for prey. Her arms were crossed tight, sunglasses perched on her face, even though the sun barely peeked over the hills, and I could hear her voice carrying across the distance as she muttered into her phone about bylaws, fines, and community protection. It was clear she had spent the entire night stewing over losing the first battle, and now she was plotting a counterattack with all the ferocity of a general preparing for war. I could practically feel her anger radiating through the air as she gestured wildly toward my gate, pointing at nothing in particular, but treating every inch of my ranch like it was a crime scene that needed to be cleaned of my presence. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching her perform, and couldn't help but think how absurd it was that a woman with no authority over my land thought she could bend reality to her will with nothing more than HOA letterheads and a shrill tone. By mid-morning, the first volley came in the form of a neatly folded piece of paper tucked under the chain of my gate. It was a notice printed with HOA logos claiming that my truck, my fence, and even my dog were violating community aesthetic rules, as if my ranch somehow fell under their cookie-cutter suburban code. The funniest part was that my land wasn't even part of their precious HOA, something I confirmed with lawyers years ago. Yet here was Karen trying to extend her imaginary empire onto my property like a medieval queen trying to annex a free kingdom. I crumpled the paper, tossed it aside, and thought that would be enough to send the message, but Karen was just getting started. Within hours, a small posse of her HOA cronies appeared. 3 people dressed like they were on their way to a PTA meeting rather than a standoff over land rights. They carried clipboards, pens clicking, eyes scanning my fences and barn like they were building a case for war crimes. I stepped out, leaned on the gate, and asked if I could help them with something, my tone deliberately polite, but carrying that sharp edge that warned troublemakers to tread carefully. They launched into a rehearsed speech about mandatory compliance with HOA rules, spouting nonsense about approved paint colors for barns, maximum height for fences, even the number of animals allowed on my property. I let them finish their little performance before pulling out my land deed, holding it up, and explaining that my ranch existed long before their HOA was ever formed, that their bylaws had no weight here, and that every second they stood trespassing on my side of the line was one more reason for me to call the sheriff. The look on their faces was priceless, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and growing panic as their imaginary power crumbled under the weight of actual law. Karen, who had been watching from the road, stormed over, face flushed, accusing me of being non-cooperative and hostile toward community harmony, as if I was the villain here for daring to own land outside their control. I couldn't help but laugh. The absurdity of the situation so thick it was impossible to take seriously. And that only made her angrier, her voice climbing higher, promising that I hadn't heard the last of this, that there were other ways to force me to comply. That last part stuck with me as the day went on because it wasn't just empty bluster. There was something darker in the way she said it. Like, this wasn't just about petty power trips anymore. It was about driving me out by any means necessary. Later that afternoon, as I walked the boundary lines of the ranch, I noticed small markers had been placed in the ground near the old north fence. Orange flags with HOA initials scribbled on them, as if they were preparing to redraw the property lines to suit their fantasy version of reality. The sheer audacity of it had me laughing at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it lit a fire in me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a deliberate attempt to chip away at my rights, my heritage, my home, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I went into town that evening to talk to an old friend who worked at the county office, and sure enough, he confirmed what I suspected. Karen had been filing nuisance complaints, attempting to claim parts of my land as shared community space, and even requesting a hearing to enforce HOA rules outside their jurisdiction. It was a move so bold and so illegal that it was almost impressive in its stupidity. My friend laughed when he showed me the stack of rejected filings, saying this wasn't the first time Karen had tried something like this. But it was definitely the first time she'd gone after someone with airtight deeds and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Driving back to the ranch under a setting sun, I knew one thing for certain. Karen had declared war, and she was willing to twist the law, rally her cronies, and invent new rules out of thin air just to get her way. But if she thought that would scare me off, she clearly hadn't been paying attention to who she was dealing with. I parked the truck, walked to the gate, and stared out toward the HOA subdivision in the distance, lights flickering in perfect soulless symmetry, a stark contrast to the wild, free land I stood on. I made a silent promise to my grandfather's memory that this ranch would not fall to petty tyrants with fake authority. And if Karen wanted to keep pushing, I was going to push back harder. Tomorrow, I would reinforce my gates, install cameras, and make sure every inch of my boundaries screamed one thing loud and clear. This is my land, and no HOA bully is going to rewrite that truth, no matter how many fake notices or late-night phone calls they throw at me. Little did Karen know she had just handed me every excuse I needed to set my own traps, both legal and personal. And soon enough, the next chapter in this battle would make yesterday's screaming match look like a warm-up act. The third day after my return to the ranch started with a heavy sky, gray clouds rolling low over the hills as if nature itself knew trouble was brewing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was about to escalate her game. I was right. Before sunrise, I found fresh footprints near my west fence. Boot tracks that weren't mine leading up to a wooden post that now bore a laminated HOA notice nailed right into my property, claiming that this section of land was under community landscaping review. The audacity was laughable, but the nail holes in my old post made my blood boil. I ripped the sign down and tossed it aside, scanning the line of footprints heading back toward the subdivision like breadcrumbs leading straight to Karen's door. By mid-morning, she arrived in person with 2 other HOA board members in tow. The trio striding toward my gate as if they owned the place. Karen's voice rang out, sharp and cutting, accusing me of ignoring repeated citations and threatening fines for everything from the color of my barn to the sound of my rooster crowing at dawn. I leaned on the fence, hands crossed, letting her rant, knowing full well that every word coming out of her mouth was nothing but hot air, but her determination to make me bend to her rules was unsettling. She pointed at my cattle grazing in the distance, claiming there were too many for the ecological balance of the HOA, then moved on to criticize my truck parked near the gate, calling it an eyesore. The other 2 nodded along like puppets, one jotting notes as if this nonsense would hold up anywhere outside their fantasy land. I finally cut her off, asking how many times I had to remind her that my ranch was outside HOA boundaries, that she had no authority here, and that trespassing onto my land was one step away from me, calling the sheriff for real. Karen didn't even blink, just smirked and said, "We'll see about that," before stomping off with her lackey. But I could tell this wasn't over. I spent the afternoon checking my property, fixing the fence posts where they had nailed their fake notices, and setting up a few trail cameras because I had a bad feeling they'd be back under cover of night. Sure enough, just as dusk settled in, my dog started barking furiously toward the north end of the ranch. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, not loaded for trouble, but enough to send a message, and rode out on my ATV to find 3 shadowy figures near my irrigation line, one of them clearly Karen by her silhouette and frantic arm gestures. They were trying to tamper with the water valve, muttering about forcing compliance by shutting off my supply. I snapped a picture with my phone before turning on the headlights, flooding the area with light and catching them like raccoons caught in the trash. Karen froze for a split second before screeching something about me, intimidating residents. But it was too late. The evidence was mine. I shouted that they were trespassing, warned them the sheriff would be seeing the footage. And for a brief moment, the bravado slipped from Karen's face, replaced by the realization that she had crossed a line even her fake HOA laws couldn't protect her from. They retreated quickly, stumbling in the dark, Karen shouting empty threats about legal action over her shoulder, as if repeating it enough times would make it true. Back at the house, I downloaded the footage, labeled the photos, and called my friend at the county office again, explaining that this was no longer harmless harassment. It was attempted sabotage of my property. He promised to pass it along to the sheriff, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing Karen's antics were finally starting to work against her. But even with that small victory, I knew this war wasn't close to over. The next morning, a new round of fake violation notices appeared. This time scattered across my driveway, claiming I owed thousands in unpaid fines for everything from unapproved structures to unauthorized animals. It was laughable but infuriating. And as I read them, I realized Karen was throwing everything she had at me, hoping sheer volume would wear me down. What she didn't understand was that this ranch had survived droughts, fires, and real threats far worse than a suburban tyrant with a clipboard. And I wasn't the type to break under pressure. That night, sitting on my porch, watching the horizon, I started planning my next move. the cameras were only the beginning. I was going to make sure every inch of my land was fortified, not just with fences and gates, but with evidence and legal backing that would bury Karen's fake authority once and for all. I thought about my grandfather and how he used to tell me this land didn't just belong to us. It was part of us, and letting anyone take even a piece of it was like letting them take a piece of your soul. Karen had crossed the line tonight, stepping beyond petty harassment into outright hostility. And in doing so, she had made sure there was no going back. The next time she tried something, I wouldn't just stand my ground. I would push back so hard her entire HOA board would regret ever stepping foot on this ranch. The battle was shifting, and I could feel it in my bones. Karen thought this was about her power, her rules, her fake sense of control. But soon she was going to learn that out here on the edge of her perfect little neighborhood, real power came from grit, stubbornness, and a willingness to fight for what was yours until the last breath. The quiet night wrapped around me as I made that promise to myself. And in the distance, I thought I heard a car door slam. Maybe Karen returning home after plotting her next move. Let her plan all she wanted. I was ready now, and this land wasn't giving an inch. By the fourth day, the battle for my own land felt like it had shifted from ridiculous to outright insane, and I woke up already bracing for whatever fresh nonsense Karen had in store for me. The sun was barely up when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside my gate, followed by that familiar shrill voice barking commands, as if she had some legal right to direct traffic on my property. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and there she was again, dressed in her HOA queen attire, oversized sunglasses perched on her face, clipboard clutched like a weapon, barking at two men in neon vests who were unloading posts and tape from a truck. It didn't take a genius to figure out what she was up to. She was about to mark my entrance for mandatory HOA inspection, despite the fact I wasn't in her jurisdiction. I didn't even bother with pleasantries this time. I walked straight down the drive, boots kicking dust, and when I reached the gate, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it with a heavy chain and padlock, letting the clang echo like a warning bell. The men hesitated, glancing nervously at Karen, who was already red-faced and screeching that I couldn't block official HOA business. I leaned on the locked gate and told her loud enough for everyone to hear that this was private property. No authority of hers extended past this line, and if she or her hired hands tried to step foot inside again, the sheriff would drag them out by the collar. The look on her face was priceless, like someone had just ripped the crown off her head in public. But instead of retreating, she went on a full-blown tirade, screaming about bylaws and fines, threatening to have my truck towed, claiming she had influence with the town council. I let her rant, half amused and half furious, because every word out of her mouth was another nail in her own coffin when the day came to expose her madness. The men in vests quickly packed up and drove off, clearly wanting no part in her fantasy crusade, leaving her standing there clutching her clipboard and screeching about non-compliance. I turned to walk back to the house, thinking that would be the end of the morning's drama. But then I heard the sound of metal scraping on gravel, and when I turned back, Karen was shaking my locked gate, rattling it like a caged animal, screaming that I couldn't lock her out of what she called community access. I walked back slowly, calm, but with a simmering anger building inside, and told her once again this was not her land, that no map, no law, no HOA paperwork would ever put this ranch under her thumb. And the sooner she accepted that, the better for both of us. She refused to listen, of course, yelling louder, accusing me of being hostile and threatening the safety of neighbors until I finally pulled out my phone, hit record, and told her to keep talking. The moment she saw the camera, her tone shifted, sputtering threats about lawyers and lawsuits before retreating to her SUV and peeling out down the road. I stood there for a long moment after the dust settled, my hands still on the locked gate, realizing just how far she was willing to go to make me bend. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was obsession, a need to control every inch of dirt around her, even if it never belonged to her in the first place. That afternoon, determined not to let her think fear would make me give up, I reinforced the gate, welding on extra bars, adding a second chain, making it abundantly clear that no one entered this land unless I opened that gate myself. The work was hot and exhausting under the midday sun, but every drop of sweat felt like reclaiming my space, like drawing a line Karen couldn't cross, no matter how many fake rules she scribbled down. By evening, I sat on the porch watching the horizon, thinking maybe I'd finally earned a quiet night when headlights flared on the road. Karen's SUV rolled up again, stopping just shy of the gate, and I could see her face twisted with outrage through the windshield. She didn't get out this time, just sat there honking repeatedly like a child throwing a tantrum, expecting me to run out and unlock it for her imaginary inspection. I didn't move. I let her honk, let her scream from inside her car about calling the sheriff, about escalating this matter to higher authorities, until finally she drove off in a fury. My dog barked once at the retreating lights, then laid his head down as if even he was tired of her nonsense. I thought that was the end of it for the night, but Karen wasn't done yet. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside near the gate. Quiet but hurried. And when I looked out from the porch, I saw her silhouette again, this time armed with bolt cutters, trying to cut through the chain like a thief in the night. I shouted loud enough to shake the still air, my voice booming across the field, and Karen froze, dropping the cutters, stammering excuses about emergency access and community safety, as if that would erase the fact she was caught red-handed breaking into private property. I told her flatly that this was her last warning, that the next time the sheriff wouldn't just take a report, he'd be hauling her away for trespassing and destruction of property. She backed away slowly, muttering under her breath before scurrying to her car and disappearing once again into the darkness. Standing there under the stars, chain still intact, I realized Karen's desperation had reached a dangerous new level, one where logic and law meant nothing to her anymore. She wanted control so badly she was willing to cross any line. And that made her unpredictable. But it also gave me an edge. The more she pushed, the more evidence I collected, the more foolish and unhinged she made herself look, and I was already planning how to turn every one of her stunts into the rope that would hang her precious HOA power once and for all. Tomorrow, I decided the fences would get higher, the locks would get stronger, and Karen would learn that the harder she tried to bully me off this land, the harder the land, and I would push back. Until the day came when it wasn't me answering to anyone but her answering for everything she had done. The fifth day of this ridiculous war between me and Karen began with an eerie quiet, the kind that usually meant she was scheming something bigger than her usual fake violation notes or loud threats from the roadside. I spent the morning mending a section of old fence by the south pasture. The smell of hay thick in the air. My dog happily chasing grasshoppers nearby when I noticed Karen's SUV creeping down the road slower than usual, circling like a vulture looking for fresh carrion. She didn't stop or yell this time, just drove past, phone glued to her ear, her face set in that determined scowl she wore when she was plotting her next power move. By noon, I found out what it was. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up just beyond my locked gate. And when I came out to see what new nonsense awaited me, there was Karen parked halfway on my property line, her SUV angled just enough that her front tires sat on my dirt road while the rest remained on the public easement. She stood beside it with arms crossed, declaring loudly that she had legal right of passage, and would continue to park there as a form of protest against my refusal to comply with HOA standards. I almost laughed because the sight of her self-crowning queen act, standing there like she was leading some civil rights march instead of throwing a tantrum about someone living free on his own land, was so absurd it could have been a comedy skit. But I didn't laugh. I just stared at her, silent, letting the weight of my patience finally run dry. She wanted a spectacle, something to feed her ego. So, I gave her one she would never forget. Without saying a word, I walked back to my workshop, grabbed a bundle of metal stakes, wire fencing, and my toolbox, and got to work. Karen shouted questions at first, asking what I was doing, then demanded I stop immediately, claiming she would call the cops again. But I ignored her. I drove my posts into the ground around her SUV. One by one, the clang of the hammer on metal ringing out like a war drum. My focus sharp as I pulled the wire fencing tight around the entire perimeter of her car. Each minute that passed, her shrill threats grew louder, morphing into screams of outrage as she realized what was happening. By the time the last section of fencing was secured, her precious SUV was neatly boxed in on my side of the property line, not damaged, not touched illegally, just contained entirely on land that belonged to me. I leaned on the final post, wiped the sweat from my brow, and told her calmly that since she had decided to park on my property without permission, I had every right to secure my land however I saw fit. Her jaw dropped, her face a furious shade of red, and the next thing I knew, she was shrieking loud enough to wake the dead, stomping her feet like a child denied candy at the store, swearing she would have me arrested, that I was kidnapping her car, that this was un-American and an act of terrorism against the HOA. The whole scene grew more absurd when other neighbors, drawn by the noise, started gathering near the road, watching the spectacle unfold. Some of them chuckled openly, muttering to each other that Karen had finally picked a fight she couldn't win. Others pulled out phones to record, knowing this was going to be the kind of legendary HOA meltdown people talked about for years. Karen saw the cameras and only grew more frantic, waving her arms, demanding someone call the sheriff, promising lawsuits big enough to bankrupt me and ruin my family name. I just stood there quietly, leaning on the fence post like a man at peace with his decision, letting her dig her own grave with every word. Eventually, the familiar sight of a patrol car appeared at the end of the road, lights flashing softly as it rolled toward us. Karen immediately sprinted to meet the officers, pouring out a wild story about me trapping her car, violating her rights, threatening her safety, on and on without taking a breath. The deputy, who had clearly dealt with her antics before, listened patiently, glanced at the fence, then walked over to me and asked for my side. I handed him my deed, pointed to where her car had crossed the property line, explained that she had parked without permission, and that I had simply erected a fence on my own land to protect it from trespassers. The deputy examined everything, took a long look at Karen's vehicle boxed in neatly behind my posts, and finally turned to her with a tone that was equal parts weary and amused. He told her flat out that she had trespassed, that I had every right to fence my own property, and that if she wanted her car out, she'd need to ask me nicely or wait until I decided to take the fencing down. The sound that came out of Karen then was somewhere between a scream and a gasp, like all the air had been sucked from her lungs and replaced with fury. She stomped her feet again, yelled that this wasn't fair, that she was going to the mayor, to the governor, maybe even the president if that's what it took to stop me. The deputy, unfazed, simply told her to stop parking on private land if she didn't want surprises like this again. As he drove away, leaving her fuming and surrounded by a growing crowd of entertained neighbors, Karen turned back to me, eyes blazing with pure hatred, and shouted promises of revenge so ridiculous they sounded like bad movie dialogue. I didn't answer her. I just tipped my hat, walked back toward my porch, and sat down with my dog at my feet, watching her pace and scream until she finally climbed back over my fence, fumbled with her phone, trying to call anyone who would listen, and stormed off on foot toward the subdivision, abandoning her trapped car like a defeated queen, leaving a lost battlefield. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the newly fenced-in SUV. And for the first time since coming home, I felt like I had struck a real blow in this ridiculous war. Karen had tried to make a mockery of my rights, tried to bully me off my own land with fake rules and louder threats. But today, the tables had turned, and the look on her face as the law sided with me was worth every second of hard work hammering those posts. I knew this fight wasn't over. That she'd come back swinging with fresh lies, new schemes, maybe even more late-night trespassing attempts. But now the whole town had seen her for what she really was, and every battle from here on out would only make her look more foolish. As night fell and the cicadas sang in the trees, I leaned back in my chair, a slow grin spreading across my face, knowing that tomorrow would bring more drama, more noise, more high stakes. Nonsense. But whatever she had planned, I'd be ready because this ranch wasn't giving an inch to Karen or her HOA empire. Not now, not ever. By the sixth day, the energy around the ranch felt like it was charged with a storm that hadn't yet broken. A strange mix of triumph from yesterday's victory over Karen and the unease of knowing she wasn't the type to take public humiliation quietly. I woke up before dawn, the ranch still cloaked in darkness. The only sound my dog padding around the porch and the faint rustle of wind through dry grass. I knew Karen wouldn't let that fence stunt go unanswered. And sure enough, before the sun had fully risen, my phone lit up with calls from unknown numbers. Voicemails filled with Karen's voice trying to sound official as she threatened me with everything from criminal charges to federal investigations. I deleted each one without listening past the first few seconds, sipping my coffee slowly as I looked out at her SUV, still trapped inside my fencing, a perfect monument to her own arrogance. But Karen's desperation had taken a new turn. By mid-morning, a small crowd gathered near the property line again. This time, not just HOA cronies, but a few town officials Karen had somehow convinced to come out and mediate the dispute. They stood awkwardly on the road as she launched into a performance about how my illegal actions endangered public safety and violated long-standing community agreements, waving fake documents like they were gospel. The officials, clearly uncomfortable but trying to keep the peace, asked to speak to me directly. So, I walked down to the gate with my folder of real deeds, property maps, and the county's own written proof that this land was outside HOA control. I laid everything out clearly, calmly, while Karen screeched in the background about fairness and harmony and how this man refuses to respect authority. When the officials saw the paperwork, saw the clearly marked boundary lines, saw that Karen's entire crusade was built on nothing but her own imagined power, their tone shifted. One of them told her flatly that she had no jurisdiction here, that every complaint she had filed was null and void, and that she needed to stop harassing a lawful property owner before the county itself stepped in against her. The color drained from her face, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But even with the truth laid bare, she couldn't stop herself, screaming about conspiracies and favoritism, accusing me of bribing officials to win this battle. The crowd that had gathered, including several neighbors now openly filming the chaos, laughed quietly, and the spectacle only grew worse for Karen as she realized her iron grip on the HOA was starting to crack in public view. People whispered about her losing control, about how ridiculous this war had become, and I could see for the first time cracks forming in her once feared persona. The humiliation stung her deeply. I could tell because within an hour she had stormed off, vowing to bring in bigger guns, leaving the so-called officials shaking their heads as they apologized to me for wasting my time. I thought that might buy me a quiet afternoon, but Karen's idea of retreat was just running home to sharpen her claws for the next attack. By evening, a black SUV I didn't recognize rolled up near my gate. A man in a suit stepping out holding a briefcase introducing himself as an attorney representing Karen and the HOA. He started reading off a long list of alleged violations, trespassing claims, emotional distress complaints, each one more absurd than the last. I let him finish before asking him plainly if he had seen my deed, if he had looked at the county records, if he even knew that Karen's HOA had zero jurisdiction past their neat little subdivision. He admitted quietly that he hadn't, that he was just following his client's instructions, and when I handed him a copy of the same records everyone else had seen, he shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had been dragged out here for nothing. The lawyer left quickly after that, muttering about needing to review the facts. And as his car drove away, I felt a swell of satisfaction knowing Karen's last card was crumbling in her hands. But the real turning point came later that night at a town meeting I was invited to attend. Word of Karen's antics had spread far and wide after the car fence incident. And now people who had once been silent victims of her HOA bullying came forward, telling their stories about her overreach, about the fear and fine she had inflicted on anyone who dared to cross her imaginary rules. I sat quietly listening, my anger growing with every testimony until it was my turn to speak. I laid out everything from the first day I arrived home to every false violation notice, every trespass, every police call, every attempt to sabotage my water supply, and finally the fence incident that proved she had no respect for private property rights. The room was dead silent when I finished, the weight of Karen's tyranny exposed under the harsh light of truth. The town council members looked furious, promising immediate investigation into HOA misconduct, and even hinted at fines and legal action against Karen herself for harassment and false reporting. When I left that meeting, people I didn't know shook my hand, thanking me for standing up to her, saying they wished they had done it sooner. Driving home under the stars, I realized this wasn't just my battle anymore. It had become a reckoning for every person Karen had steamrolled in her quest for control. I parked the truck by the porch, feeling the cool night breeze on my face, and looked out at the fence still holding Karen's abandoned SUV like a trophy. For the first time since returning home, I felt hope that this nightmare might actually end. Not because she would stop on her own, but because the whole community was finally seeing her for what she truly was. Tomorrow, I plan to take all the evidence I had, every recording, every photo, every signed statement from witnesses, and hand it directly to the county sheriff and an attorney of my own. If Karen wanted to play legal games, I was about to end hers permanently with the full force of the law on my side. The battle had started with screams and fake rules, but now it was turning into a war she couldn't win. And as I sat on the porch with my dog at my feet and the night sky stretching wide above me, I smiled knowing the final round was coming soon and it wouldn't be me locked behind any gates. The final day of this war dawned heavy and restless, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed hesitant to sing, as if they too sensed the tension building around the ranch. I had spent the night going over every scrap of evidence, every photo, every recording, every signed statement from neighbors who had finally found their courage to speak out against Karen and her fabricated reign of terror. The fence still stood tall around her abandoned SUV like a quiet monument to her arrogance. But today wasn't about petty revenge anymore. Today was about ending this madness once and for all. As the sun climbed higher, I loaded all my files into the truck and drove to the county sheriff's office, greeted by nods and handshakes from people who had heard about the ongoing feud and wanted to see justice finally done. The sheriff, a gruff man with no patience for theatrics, listened carefully as I laid out everything from the day of my return to the endless harassment, the false police reports, the attempted sabotage of my waterline, and finally the audacity of Karen parking on my land and screaming victim when she got fenced in. I handed over every bit of proof. And he promised that by the end of the day, this wouldn't just be gossip anymore. It would be an official case of harassment, trespassing, and abuse of local ordinances. That promise felt like the first real weight lifted since I had stepped foot back on my grandfather's land. But of course, Karen wasn't about to let her empire crumble quietly. By the time I returned to the ranch, a full crowd had gathered near my gate. Karen in the center of it all, her face red, her voice cracking as she delivered what she must have thought was a triumphant finale. She had called the cops yet again, had brought HOA board members waving their useless rulebooks, had even dragged a news crew out, hoping to spin the story in her favor and paint me as a violent, unhinged neighbor terrorizing their perfect little community. It would have been laughable if not for the sheer desperation dripping from every word she shouted into the cameras. I parked my truck slowly, stepped out with calm, deliberate movements, and walked toward the gathering without saying a word. Every eye followed me, waiting for a brawl, waiting for me to lose my temper and give Karen the spectacle she craved. But instead, I simply reached into my jacket and pulled out the signed statement from the sheriff's office, a fresh document declaring Karen and her HOA under investigation for harassment, trespassing, and abuse of power. I handed a copy to the news reporter, another to the nearest deputy, and let the truth speak louder than any shouting match could. The effect was instant. Karen's voice faltered, her tirade stumbling as the crowd leaned in to read the papers, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The deputy stepped forward, telling her clearly and firmly that this nonsense had gone on long enough that any further attempt to step foot on my property or interfere with my life would result in immediate arrest. Karen's face twisted, a storm of disbelief and rage colliding all at once, and she screamed something incoherent about conspiracies, about corruption, about how everyone was against her because they couldn't handle her standards. But no one was listening anymore. The spell she had held over this community for years was broken. The fear she thrived on gone now that everyone had seen how powerless she truly was. Neighbors who had once cowed under her petty fines now spoke up, laughing openly, calling her out for every cruel and ridiculous stunt she had ever pulled. The cameras caught it all. The HOA queen stripped of her crown in front of the whole town. And for the first time since this all began, it wasn't me who looked like the villain in her story. The final blow came when the tow truck arrived, called not by Karen, but by the sheriff himself to remove her SUV from my land since it was now considered evidence in the ongoing investigation. As the truck hauled it away, Karen screamed louder than I had ever heard. A wail of fury and humiliation that echoed across the open fields. The sound of someone watching their false kingdom crumble to dust. She lunged toward my gate one last time, fists clenched, spitting threats of lawsuits and revenge. But the deputies stepped in, warning her that one more outburst would land her in cuffs. She froze, trembling with rage before finally turning on her heel and storming off down the road. Her entourage scattering like leaves in the wind. The once feared ruler of the HOA reduced to a solitary defeated figure no one wanted to follow anymore. The news crew caught every second of it, and by that evening the entire town and beyond knew the story of the HOA tyrant who had tried to steal what wasn't hers and lost everything in the process. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, I stood by my gate, finally free of the constant weight that had clung to me since my first day back. Neighbors came by to shake my hand, to thank me for standing up, not just for myself, but for every person Karen had ever bullied. The ranch felt lighter that night, as if even the land was sighing in relief that the battle was finally over. I walked the fence line under the stars, my boots crunching softly against the dirt, thinking about my grandfather and how proud he would have been to see the ranch defended with grit and patience instead of letting it fall to people who thought power came from loud voices and fake rules. When I reached the porch, my dog at my side, I locked the gate one last time and leaned against it, a quiet grin spreading across my face. For the first time in years, I knew this land was truly safe again. The HOA had no claim here. Karen had no power left, and the only sound that carried across the open fields now was the peaceful hum of a ranch free from tyranny. I went inside, poured a drink, and sat by the window, watching the moon rise over my grandfather's hills, knowing this war was finally won. Not just with fences and locked gates, but with truth, determination, and a refusal to ever bow to someone who thought they could own what was never theirs to begin with.